Whether you're a new age outlaw or if it's a new day, being a world tag team champion is a pretty great thing. After all, tag team wrestling is the staple of any good wrestling promotion. However, that wasn't always the case. Now, as scary as it may seem, once upon a time, tag teams just didn't exist. But fear not, this episode is not about those dark times. This episode is actually all about the magnificent beginnings of something that many wrestling fans just take for granted. Because today, Dave knows the history of tag team wrestling. As mind-blowing as it is to think tag team wrestling wasn't always around, but how did it begin? Well, truth be told, we don't really know. While some wrestling match types have clear-cut beginnings with factual, reliable, documented information, tag team wrestling just isn't one of those types of matches. But while there's no official information on how tag team wrestling began, that's not to say there isn't some unofficial information. And it's also all we got, so we might as well just get into it. Now, the most commonly accepted story is that the first tag team wrestling match of all time took place in San Francisco in 1901. As the story goes, tag team wrestling was created in order to make things more exciting and add a bit of variety to the card. And from there, tag team wrestling remained as more of a regional style in the San Francisco area, still needing some time to catch on elsewhere. Now, need I remind you that this story, even though it is widely accepted as the true origins of tag team wrestling, still has no reliable record to prove that this actually is true. Yes, there are written articles and books from the modern era that claim this story as fact, but there are no known documents of this first tag team match itself ever taking place at that time, which is a little suspect if you ask me. Now, it could wind up being 100% true that 1901 San Francisco is indeed the birthplace of tag team wrestling. And there could just be no advertisements, newspaper articles, or reliable documents from that time to survive into the modern day. But without reliable publications from that specific time and location, we cannot claim that story as actual fact, no matter how many other people do. But on the reverse end of the spectrum, there are those who dispute the entire story altogether. And some will state that the real beginnings of tag team wrestling came in the form of a tornado match in 1936 in the town of Houston, Texas. Now, unlike the alleged 1901 San Francisco match, this bout is documented, and we even have reviews for it, which definitely lends us some advantages. Where those early 20th century West Coast bouts leave us without knowing who was in them and who came up with the idea and what the rules were, we know all these details about the 1936 Houston match, and we also know how the match played out. Okay, so here it goes. The City Auditorium in Houston, Texas held wrestling on Friday nights. Then one week, promoter Morris Sigel had a brilliant thought. He pondered that if a one-on-one contest was exciting, then a two-on-two contest should be twice as exciting. So on October 2nd, 1936, he decided to book what many consider to be the very first tag team wrestling match of all time. Now, it's important to note that there was no tagging yet, as this match had all of its participants in the ring at the same time to do battle. This kind of match would eventually become known as a Texas Tornado match, but is now simply known as a Tornado Tag match, which never really made any sense to me since there's no actual tagging involved. Anyway, back to the original match itself. The bout was 2 out of 3 falls, and it featured the team of Heinrich Steinborn and Whisker Savage, facing off against Tiger Daula and Fazul Muhammad. Now, the match was scheduled to be the main event of the show that night, featured as something of a special attraction, and for being the first of its kind, it does sound fairly entertaining. Heinrich Steinborn was built as a German strongman who would do feats of strength like lifting cars and even elephants, and he was partnered up with Whisker Savage, who was a Texas local and a bit of a hometown hero. Now, after the bell rang, their opponents, the foreign heels of Tiger Daula and Fazul Muhammad, managed to take Whiskers and tie him up in the ropes. They then turned their attention to Steinborn, who, as strong as he might be, couldn't fight off the 2-on-1 onslaught and thus succumbed for the first fall. After this vicious beatdown, doctors came to the ring and declared that Steinborn could not continue, thus leaving the local hero, Whisker Savage, all alone to take on the heels. And after a series of slams and pinwheels, Savage lost, thus leaving Daula and Fazul standing victorious in what just might be the very first tag team wrestling match of all time. Now, regardless of whether you believe the 1901 story or this 1936 one, there are definitely some takeaways to ascertain here. First, both camps tend to credit the 1936 match in Houston for getting tag team wrestling to spread, even though in 1936 there were definitely some scathing reviews on it. The bout was actually called a freak team match by one reviewer who went on to say that the participants did not register well after a good preliminary show. Some thought that this radical deviation from the norm was just too chaotic, and they thought that the 1936 Texas Tornado match needed some structure, something to regulate all the bedlam. And that brings us to our next point. Who actually invented the tag? Well, again, we don't know, but there are some bits that we can draw from. Now, if you believe the 1901 story, then our lack of evidence does raise an issue, because that story states that the first tag team match of all time was in 1901. Now, this implies that tagging was just always a role from team wrestling's very inception. On the other hand, if you believe the 1936 story, then team wrestling began as a tornado match, but the tag itself would be invented later on, but then again, with no proof of how or when specifically. Either way, I do believe the tag was invented in order to regulate and bring a sense of order to the match, as well as keeping things more recognizable to traditional one-on-one matches. And also, while we don't know exactly when the tag was invented, we do know that by 1945, the tag was definitely a thing, because that's when we first had the AWA Southern Tag Team Championship, which was first held by Jack Purden and Garza Lozano. But the exact time and location to when they were first crowned champions is not known. Although it is believed by some to be April 30th, 1945 in Birmingham, Alabama. The next evolutionary step for tag teams came from the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, it's important to note that the NWA was very protective of using the term NWA World Champion when it came to singles competition. But when it came to the term World Tag Team Champions, on the other hand, well, not so much. Unlike for singles competition, the NWA allowed individual territories to create their own World Tag Team Championships. And from there, this is when things began to pick up. By the 1950s, NWA territories were creating tag team titles left and right. An additional 13 NWA World Tag Team titles were created in the 1950s alone. And keep in mind, this does not include all the non-World Tag Team titles that were also created in that decade either. So at this point, tag team wrestling had become all the rage with the hep wrestling cats out there. But there were still some variation. While 2-on-2 matches became the norm, 3-on-3 was also beginning to spread at this time. While outside of Chikara, it never really caught on in America, 3-on-3 tag matches or trios matches became very popular in Mexico. Since then, tag team wrestling has become a standard in wrestling. It's also gone through a variety of changes with things as well as tag team cage matches, gauntlets, and of course, TLC matches, all being brought into the mix. Not to mention the little innovations such as tag ropes, lucha libre tag rules, and the well-known fabulous Freebird rule. And all this has allowed tag team wrestling to become the glorious revolution that it has become today. But what do you think? Do you believe the 1901 story, or are you a 1936er? Or do you have another potential origin for tag team wrestling? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, this has been Dave Knows.